another ACP automation adventure. In this episode, we're going to define project-based learning, also known as PBL. We're going to discuss the three domains of learning: cognitive domain, psychomotor domain, and affective domain of learning. We're going to also talk about the 4 C's of 21st century skills and how they relate to employer needs. And I think most importantly, teachers will receive information on how to structure their lessons in this PBL style. At the end of this episode, listeners will understand how PBL, again, project-based learning, increases skill sets and motivations for learners.
The teachers writing down furiously. The students have their heads down and back up, 1,000 times, taking copious notes to try to get all the things on paper that the teacher is telling you is fair game for the test.
Yes.
There's not a whole lot of learning that goes on there. It's really a whole lot of writing and regurgitation. That's not deep learning, right? So, but that's what teachers and that's what students are used to. So imagine when, as a teacher, you come in front of a class and you say, okay, I'm not going to tell you what you need to know on the test.
All right, we're back. Welcome back, Brian. How's it going?
Oh, it's great. Everything's great. Busy
That's
day,
really
but good to be with you.
Yes, it's always busy. And I started thinking, I'm like, it's always busy too for teachers. Thank God it's the summertime, but this phase that we just went through with COVID, with the teachers having to get creative and figure out how in the world they're going to keep their students engaged at home. And, I'm hearing this PBL, project-based learning. I've heard a lot of it lately, and I wanted to talk with you about it. What is PBL?
PBL, it's one of my favorite topics. PBL stands for problem and project-based learning. And a lot of people may think that that's the same thing, but they're actually two distinct things, which we'll talk about in a moment here. But PBL is a very highly rewarding style of teaching, or what we use in education speak, pedagogy. It's a method to imbue in students high-level skills, like the 21st century workforce skills that you hear a lot of, and the ability for students to communicate and collaborate. PBL really promotes that kind of outcome with students. And I'll share with you a screen. We do a lot of train the trainer events with the Best Center and ACP support at national workshops, in which
and
we
train
promote.
The trainer. I'm sorry. What is train the trainer?
Train the trainer is where you take educators in the same profession and you share with them best practices of how they might instruct, teach their students at their respective schools. So part of our mission with the National Science Foundation Best Center, and truly part of ACP's mission, is to upskill instructional methods and practices, pedagogy again, in education speak, at the nation's community, technical, and university higher education, post-secondary education. So PBL comes up all the time. In fact, when I was doing my master's in education, PBL is what I chose for my thesis, because PBL, particularly at the community and technical college level, increases engagement and retention of students. It's been proven in very large studies that if you employ PBL in the classroom at community and technical colleges, because that's about the only place you can engage students in a school where you don't have students living on campus, that's the best method to improve engagement with the students and ultimately retain them, hopefully to graduate from the institution. So it's a very important topic. So let me share some slides with you from the Train the Trainer event we did. This was last year at a national workshop at UC Berkeley National Labs in California. So I'll start with this slide. Hopefully you can see it here.
Yes, I see it.
Okay. The slide is entitled PBL, Problem and Project-Based Learning. And the picture you see is actually a student who was engaged in PBL former students. One of them is a technical college student, and I know it's very difficult to see. One came from a sister institution, Georgia State University, who was also involved in this project-based learning. In this case, they designed a solar tracking mount for solar panels, engineered it, designed it, did a little working model of it, really something. And we'll get into how that connects to project-based learning in a moment. But as I've stated, it's a proven pedagogy which promotes 21st century skill development, improves retention and learning outcomes for students. Project-based learning is an immersive instructional method whereby students create unique public products through collaborative efforts and in pursuit of a driving question or a challenge, which requires the students to employ research, independent research, and collaborate with their teammates to be able to solve that particular problem or project. And you see the Best Center logo at the bottom right there, this being a Best Center event where we trained our other instructors. So problem-based or project-based learning, what are the differences between the two? Well, in problem-based learning, the learning goals and outcomes are shared at the beginning of the exercise, and they typically are more well-defined lessons that you provide to students. So although there are multiple routes in solving the particular problem, the end result is pretty well defined and often focuses on one particular discipline with specific learning steps along the way for the students. These are typically case studies, scenarios. Think about medical school, okay? So we've all heard of the clinical phase that medical students have to go through. That's a classic example of a problem-based learning approach. In the 1970s, medical schools around the country were learning what we're learning today, that their students were not as engaged in the broad and deep content of medical studies. And they weren't developing the critical thinking necessary to be able to identify a particular root cause of illness, right? So they changed their approach to include problem-based learning, which became what's now termed the clinical phase of medical school education, where the doctors who would be coming out would be better prepared to communicate, to collaborate, communicate, but also to use critical thinking in determining what the real root cause of the problem is, and then prescribe some kind of antidote or curative agent, hopefully, for that malady. So that's where problem-based learning really got its start in the United States, is in medical schools. Project-based learning is a little bit more evolved, and by that I mean not necessarily better or worse than problem-based learning, but requires some more effort on the part of students and instructors to effectively deliver. And the outcomes are also, the resultant outcomes are typically greater as well. The learning goals are set for the project, but the project has no one particular definition for the end result. There's no one right solution. So projects result in unique outcomes, which is part of the fun of project-based learning. They're multidisciplinary, always multidisciplinary, because you want the project to be beyond the capabilities of any one student to solve themselves, which forces the collaborative and the communication elements of project-based learning and the fostering of those 21st century skills. There are general learning waypoints along the way where the instructor, instead of being a sage on the stage telling the students what they have to know to prepare for the test, they step back and act as a colleague, a supporter, a guide on the side, if you will, in getting the students through those waypoints of investigation to the ultimate realization of their selected project, which hopefully will meet the outcomes that are set at the beginning for learning that the instructor sets. And then they address authentic real-world problems or projects. They have a complex driving question which sustains inquiry and sustains the investigation and highly motivates students because they've had a hand in selecting the project that they're working on. And we always see in project-based learning more ownership, more motivation, more interest in getting to that solution of our ultimate realization of the project itself. And I'll close with this on the definition. Here you see a subset of instructors, technical college instructors, largely from around the United States, who were assigned a project at one of our national institutes. This was maybe a year or two ago. And you can see the level of engagement. I don't have to describe to you. You look at how engaged everyone is, their focus is there, their motivation is there, they're excited, some of them smiling and communicating, and everybody engaged in doing the actual doing of pursuit of either inquiry or the wiring of their particular project. So that says it all right there about the value.
The first thing I'm noticing is the energy, the excitement. Everyone is working together. They're focused, they're engaged. And essentially what you're saying is that these instructors or instructors like these in the picture will take this style of teaching and replicate it back into their classrooms. And essentially, is this how it would look like as well in the building automation systems laboratory?
Yeah, this is indicative and representative of what you see with students. So when we're training instructors, we try to put them through the same paces that their students would experience in
Exactly.
like project-based learning or problem-based learning. It's interesting, at the technical and community college level, many of the instructors are hired because of their technical acumen and not necessarily because they are trained as educators. So when you present a new model of teaching, sometimes there's a little resistance to that, but the proof is in the pudding. And as we put our instructors through these real world, authentic problems and projects, they became true believers in the value of PBL to their
Right.
classroom and hopefully carry this back to their students.
And speaking to the instructors, the particular group of instructors, like you said, more of the traditional route, they stand in front of the classroom, they're writing on the whiteboard, probably no eye contact whatsoever the entire time with their students. I think you and I both had those experiences growing up.
Absolutely.
My question is, back to that picture is so exciting. It's engaging for that group of instructors. It can be possibly overwhelming to transition into a PBL style of teaching. So what tips would you have for those instructors who would essentially start to include that into their lessons?
Right. So I would share my personal experience as an educator. I spent 15 years either as an adjunct instructor or a full-time instructor. And of course, we developed the nation's first building automation systems program, which lends itself greatly to problem-based and project-based learning. So that was the go-to style of training that we would expose our students to because we knew that it worked. But there are challenges in PBL, and I'm going to focus my comments primarily on project-based learning since it is that more evolved form. If you can do project-based learning, you can certainly do problem-based learning for students. Project-based learning requires effort on the part of the instructor to clearly identify the learning outcomes which will be representative of a successful student effort. Okay, while the projects will result in a whole collection of interesting outcomes that you can't even predict as an instructor. They do have to meet the requirements of the project learning objectives, and that's the onus is on the students and the instructor to help guide them through the development of their project so that they will meet the learning outcomes without restricting their inquiry. So, as you might imagine, to be able to lay all those steps out in a learning style which is by nature focused on the student sustaining their own inquiry, there's a lot of planning that goes into that. So an instructor, first and foremost, has to have the tools and the understanding to lay out that plan for the for the students and to provide the necessary resources, and even to select the appropriate teams. There's some groups that will have internal issues because of, you might not have paired the right individuals. All that has to be planned out. Through ACP and the Best Center, we've taken a lot of pains in providing templates for lesson plans specifically for problem and project-based learning. And then all the lessons that we provide in the train the trainer exercises have been codified so that the instructors can take them back to the classroom. So while that is a challenge, we're trying to help the instructors deal with that challenge by making it easier on the planning side. But planning is one of the big challenges. Number two, the other big challenge is the reception of the students to PBL. It's a different style and approach than what most students are used to. You started out this segment by relating your experience as sitting in a classroom where you're being taught by the instructor. They're writing on the board, perhaps a whiteboard or a smart board, or in my era, a chalkboard, about the things that you have to learn to be able to pass the test, right? Mm-hmm. So the teachers are writing down furiously. The students have their heads down and back up, 1,000 times, taking copious notes to try to get all the things on paper that the teacher is telling you is fair game for the test.
Yes.
There's not a whole lot of learning that goes on there. It's really a whole lot of writing and regurgitation. That's not deep learning, right? Mm-hmm. So, but that's what teachers and that's what students are used to. So imagine when, as a teacher, you come in front of a class and you say, okay, I'm not going to tell you what you need to know on the test. That's a problem right away for a student, right? That's a problem.
Let's just be honest. That's going to create problem number one.
That's problem number one. Okay, I'm not going to teach you what you need to know on the test. What? Yeah. Okay, that's a change. Then number two, you're going to be guiding your own development of skills and inquiry, and you're going to select your own project, which makes you become now creative. Mm-hmm. Which a lot of students, and I know, I get it. You're tired, you go to class, and you just tell me what I need to know to pass the test, right? Yeah. I'm not going to tell you what you need to know. In fact, you're going to develop what you need to develop to pass this course through creative, collaborative, and communicative effort with group members. Mm-hmm. Whoa, those are all kind of anathema to students, right? I got to work in a group. I got to work with a student who might not perform. I got to be held accountable. I got to create something. And then I got to be able to communicate that unique work product to an audience, another big fear of students.
Especially adult students. I think you mentioned that earlier. I can see that pushback being a lot there.
It's a strong pushback. So we even have received pushback when we try to take educators through PBL exercises, but they become believers when they see and we prove to them that they retain more, that they've developed more skills, and that they will remember what they learn. So once you get the students, you have to be ready as an instructor to have those answers available. Why are we doing this? I'm paying you to teach me, right? Oh, we're teaching you, trust me. We're going to teach you in a new, innovative style, which has a lot of history and proof that it works. But we're going to make you be a willing participant in this, or sometimes unwilling participant at first, and take ownership of your own education. And that's where has been shown ever since, Dewey, who was an educational theorist early in the 20th century, and even before him, they proved this time and time again, that active, participative learning in a group setting where you communicate and actively engage provides the best educational outcome. So that's number two. The biggest thing you're going to get as an instructor is the pushback. Good news. Once the students get engaged and into their project, they take ownership so quickly and they become so motivated because they're interested to see what that project's going to become. And then they want to share that. And so the hurdles and the issues that they had in the beginning, of not wanting to share, not communicate, collaborate, they fade away so quickly into an environment and a picture like you just saw. a
Hmm.
group of individuals who are focused, motivated, pursuing their own, taking ownership for and pursuing the answers to their own questions, and then developing some kind of end product that they can share publicly. So those are the two main challenges in executing PBL. Once PBL is developed, and
Hmm.
once an instructor takes a course, a student or a course through that exercise, it becomes a lot less difficult for the instructor. It's easier for the instructor because the instructor is not always having to get in front of the classroom and write on the board.
Right.
It
Or feel
becomes
like they
easier
have
for
to
both.
perform and
Absolutely.
hmm.
You got it. So, yeah, those are the two, as I see it, the two greatest hurdles in why PBL is not being employed more by our instructors across the country.
Those are really good tips too, Brian, in how to overcome those challenges within the classroom setting. So I'm wondering how can teachers and parents support PBL at home, especially during this time with COVID?
Sure. PBL has been around for a long time now. In K-12 in particular, it has pretty deep penetration, and there are a lot of lessons available, freely available out there online. Of course, at the community technical college level, we at the Best Center and ACP, we're two different organizations, but we're closely aligned with our efforts and work together closely, of course. But we have freely available exercises for building automation um, instructors in particular that we share and we continue to build upon. So that's a place where instructors can go, and then if they have some equipment they can send home with their students can be working in projects, on projects together. Um, there's a good bit of content out there online. I would point people first off to that content that's out there. There's an institute out there called the Buck Institute for PBL, and that's a very good resource, particularly for K-12 PBL exercises that students who are trying to get STEM related, or there's a lot of stuff out there
Yep.
for STEM at
Those STEM
home. Yeah,
activities.
they can
Hmm.
find great resources there.
That's really good. These are really good tips. We talked about the benefits with we talked about the benefits for students. We talked about the benefits for teachers that the students and teachers receive from this PBL structured style of teaching and learning. What about employers? How will employers receive value and benefit from this style of learning?
Oh, it's a good question. So I've developed a number of programs both in Atlanta and helped develop programs around the country in building automation, energy efficiency, even in refrigeration, etc. And the first step in establishing a new program of study at the college level is to do a what we call a DACM, or a research study, where it stands for designing a curriculum. Okay, that method and approach, which was first founded by Ohio State in the 1950s, who are absolutely the best at doing it. All the DACMs I've been involved with, by the way, we hire a professional from Ohio State University's education department come down and guide that. But what it in essence is a collection of experts in that area who come together and define the skills and the outcomes, the knowledge, skills, and abilities and attitudes which a successful graduate should have when they're seeking employment. Now, why is this related to the question that you asked? Well, in almost every DACM we've done, I won't say almost every, I will say every single DACM I've been involved with, the idea of 21st century skills, which we'll define as the four C's: communication, collaboration, critical thinking, and creativity, the four C's of 21st century skills, which we often term as soft skills, right? The skills that you don't commonly think of when you go to college that you're going there to get. You think of the technical skills or the workplace skills. But employers continuously rate soft skills as more important to them than even the technical skills, if you can believe it. I know in our DACM, when we first started our program, the two most prevalent skills that employers are seeking in graduates are the ability to communicate in a written and oral fashion. So communication, that's one of the C's. and the ability to think critically or analytically. That's another one of the C's. Those two, almost without exception, to an employer are highest rated. And if they're not 1 and 2, they're right up there in the top 5, along with specific technical skills that they might require. So when you start to understand the depth of the need there,
Right.
it just brings home the importance of using high-level pedagogy or educational approaches to establishing those 21st century skills. And there's no better than PBL to establish those 4 C's in students.
And I think that that's key. Like you said, once we understand the need. So in your training sessions, when you go around and train the trainer sessions, that's where you have that time to really dig deep and have the audiences understand that need, and then they can work backwards and begin to structure their classrooms and their environments in this PBL style of learning and teaching.
That's
So
right.
Brian,
Can I add one thing to that, Candace?
oh yeah,
Those skills in particular, I want to harp on the soft skills for just one more moment here, because those are the skills which you can't teach in one class period or one course.
right,
Soft skills have to be prevalent and woven through multiple courses, because when you're talking about changing the person and the way they communicate, the way that they think,
yes,
you're really teaching them how to learn and how to deploy those skills on a day-to-day basis. That takes time, and so there has to be a real well thought out plan from start to finish by educators to deploy PBL in a regular fashion in every course, so that they're working on those soft skills, which are so important to employers.
that's so important, Brian. Thank you so much for taking the time out right now to discuss what project problem based learning is all about and the value in restructuring your programs to begin teaching and having your students learn this style. We're going to take a quick little break. We'll be back because there's so much more, so many other questions that I have to ask you. So we'll be right back, you guys. So, Brian, continuing with our conversation, we just finished talking about PBL, problem and project based learning. What are the 3 domains of learning?
There are 3 domains of learning. And there's education speak to these domains of learning, and then there's commonly understood definitions, which will help us all know that we're talking about the same thing. And I'll share both of them with you. Okay. So the 3 domains of learning in the education speak world are cognitive, psychomotor, and affective domain of learning. Now, if you know all of those, Candace, we can stop the podcast right here. But
No,
no, I'll continue.
I definitely
Sounds
need
like
you
you
to
have some.
continue and
Okay.
explain because that third one for sure is something I have not heard.
So let's go into the definitions of those. Okay, so cognitive is a fancy way of saying book learning. When we say that, hey, I'm a better book learner, or I'm a better reader, just tell me what I need to know, point me to a resource, and I'll learn it. That's the cognitive domain of learning. Okay. Then the psychomotor domain of learning is what we call the hands-on skills, the technical skills, or the applied skills. You hear that quite often: applied skills, technical skills. Hands-on is the most commonly used term when you're talking about psychomotor. That's that domain of learning, engaging the body, motion, those kind of things. The affective domain of learning is the one that most people have not heard of and don't recognize commonly as a domain of learning unless you've been trained as an educator. And the affective domain of learning, think of it as, how does something affect me? It's the emotional domain of learning. It's our heart. It's how do things in life move us? Now, why in the world would that be a domain of learning? Well, researchers for a long time have known, and as I speak about this, those who are listening to the show will understand this as well. Think about it like this. If you're excited to learn something new, you're probably going to take more pain and effort to acquire those skills and be more motivated to get those skills. In other words, if you love to dance. I know you're a dancer. You love to dance.
Hmm.
So you seek out opportunities to learn dancing, and your mind and your heart is there. So you pick up those skills so much more quickly because your mind is in the right frame of mind to receive those skills and receive that learning because it's what you love, right? You're moved to do that. There's a real neurological basis for that, which we won't get into, but an extensive amount of research has proven that when your mind is in a peaked state and you're emotionally engaged, that the parts of the brain that control that then lay down much stronger neural pathways for retention of learning and for acquisition of skills. So the affective domain of learning, the emotional domain of learning, I always tell educators is really the start of learning, the most important domain, because if you don't have that emotional connection and preparation in your students, they're not going to remember what you taught them.
Right.
We all know this intuitively as teachers, or even as parents, or even as somebody who's tried to teach somebody something. Everybody has had this experience when they're drifting. Okay, they're not there. They're not engaged. They're not receiving the learning.
Right.
I'm gonna break this down a little bit more because it's so important. Going back to what we discussed in the previous segment, and even about the cognitive domain of learning, you hear so often from professors and teachers, hey, it's not my job to motivate students. Hey, it's not my job to get you excited about what you're learning. Hey, it's not my job to be an actor or whatever. It's my
Right.
job to just present the material. And to that I respond, if it's not your job to do that and to motivate, you're not doing your job, period.
Hmm.
Because it's your job as an instructor to use all the means at your disposal to get your students to learn and acquire skills. And that always
Right.
includes an element of becoming an actor and becoming somebody who, in education speak, hooks their students at the very beginning of the lesson with something interesting, something that moves them on a human level, on an emotional level, that
Right.
gains their interest. Even if they're not
Right.
focused on your particular topic, there's a way to relate that to them and their experiences, which brings them in and gets them in the zone, ready for learning. That's the
Right.
affective domain. That's the importance of the affective domain.
I think it's a shame too that sometimes, we run into, like you said, that response from educators will say, it's not my job to do X, but it's my job to teach. And then my response, similar to yours, is always that, well, that is teaching. And I think it's unfortunate that, you know, some people will think that when you add this, I, I can't say flair because it's not a flair. It's not a additive. It is all encompassing of teaching. It's unfortunate that it's looked upon as a style of entertainment, or I'm not here to uh, push and motivate your students in this way to get them to pay attention. They should automatically learn. They should sit still, and soak in the information that teachers give them the way that they choose to give them. I think that that's unfortunate, and what you're saying is really important. Why do you think though that affective domain isn't as widely known and discussed?
Well, in the United States in particular, we've set up, when the educational system was set up, it was set up in a manner to rank order students based on performance on written tests and to provide a rationale for why some students would get opportunities that other students would not get. Some would be routed to those opportunities because, well, they did better on a test. And to an extent, our system is still set up on that rank order system. And it's easier to take that draconian kind of approach to education where an instructor shows up, they just present the material, they test the students either do well or they do poorly, and that's the rationale for directing students to wherever they're directed, right?
Right.
It's unfortunate though because we don't live in that society anymore. We live in a society that's supposed to be open and provide equitable. We know it's not true, but it's supposed to provide equitable education for everybody. And that starts in the classroom. So much of of what's rooted in our society and a lot in people's lives is connected to education. So my position is we need to do everything we can as educators and use every
Right.
trick in the book. I won't even say trick, every established theoretical approach which is proven to be effective to teach our students if we're truly invested in their success and equitable opportunities. An instructor
Right.
will deploy these methods. And I'll finish with this one thing, not to get too theoretical here, but I'm going to bring a little theory in because it's a very important topic to me. We are socially designed creatures. You know, whatever you believe, you have to acknowledge that we are meant to communicate. We're meant to be in communities. We're meant to be in families. We're meant to share our experiences. And if you think about the root word of that community communication, it's commune. It's having a shared set of experiences. Okay, why do I bring this up? Educators, educational theorists, I mentioned, I think, John Dewey earlier, Kilpatrick, you name it, going back to antiquity, always understood that to really teach somebody something or to really learn something, you have to do that in some form of a community or some form of communication, which involves community, a sharing between individuals and a valuing of what's been shared in the broader community, right? That's what brings in the heart element. That's what brings in the human element. That's what truly has to happen in a classroom for real learning to take place, is that communication, that commune, that community of practice. It's all related to the same root word and concept in communication and sharing with one another. If that's not happening in the classroom, real learning is not taking place.
Right. And Brian, out of the three domains that you just explained, which ones are commonly being used and which ones are being neglected?
Yeah, that's another, it pulls on the same kind of thread which we've been discussing here. So cognitive is the easiest. Okay,
Hmm.
cognitive is layered and commonly into 6 levels of depth of acquisition of skills in that domain. The psychomotor is organized typically into 7 levels, and then the affective domain is, I don't even, well, there you go, I don't even remember, and I'm a trained educator. Okay, I think it's 5,
Gotcha.
there might be 7 levels of depth in that particular domain. The cognitive is by far and away the most deployed
Hmm.
means and domain of learning because it's easy. It's
Right.
easy for an instructor and a student to understand, hey, these are the things you need to know. So let's list them out and let's test you, and there you go. A psychomotor evaluation is somewhat more difficult because you have to establish some means of performance standards that have to be to some level subjectively assessed by an instructor to say, oh, okay, we had this student, the assignment was to braze a number of fittings together
Right.
in a seal tight, airtight or watertight, fluid tight type of arrangement. Well, that can be somewhat subjective in nature, right? For how that's assessed, the performance on that. So that's a little bit less used. Even in technical schools, it's less used than in the cognitive domain. The domain that's rarely addressed is the affective domain. And this
Hmm.
is something I preach on at our workshops and nationally. Actually, I've written some white papers on this for the American Association of Community Colleges, for instance. The most commonly neglected domain of learning is that affective domain of learning because it's hard to quantify how you impact somebody in the emotional domain. So educators typically don't even deal with it when they're writing their curriculum and the learning objectives and outcomes for their curriculum, but they need to,
Hmm.
because if they can include those affective domains of learning in written form in their curriculum, they're much more likely to address them in their lesson planning, if they're doing lesson planning, and um, and then think about how they'll impact emotionally their students along the way. So definitely a lot of work needs to take place in bringing up more focus in our educators to the affective domain of learning and its importance.
So, Brian, that was some really good information. You explaining the cognitive domain, the psychomotor domain, and the affective domain of learning, these three domains of learning. What I'm going to do is take a break now, and we're going to get right back to it in just a moment because I have some questions of something that you mentioned earlier about the skill sets that are necessary for the 21st century. So, we'll get right back into in just a moment. So, Brian, something you mentioned earlier, we were discussing the skill sets that were needed for the 21st century. What are these 21st century skills that you think that students are needing to know in order to be better prepared for the workforce?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The style of learning, there's a lot that's been said about our young people are learning differently. They're exposed, and it's a lot of it's true. I mean, they have a level of technology that we didn't have in my generation. They have all kinds of distractions, et cetera, et cetera. But it's interesting. The skills that employers most list as 21st century skills are the four C's. Okay, communication, collaboration, critical thinking, and creativity. And one could argue that on the creativity side, perhaps there are some advantages to being highly stimulated in a digital space or whatever. But one would be, and even so, I would say, let's see, communication, critical thinking, creativity, collaboration.
Collaboration.
Okay. I would say one would be hard pressed to say that the other three are being fostered um, due to the technological revolution, let's just say, right?
I see.
It's been well reported and documented that we don't communicate as well as we used to. I know firsthand that this is true as an educator, that the students that I would see year after year, after 15 years of teaching either as adjunct or full time, would have more and more problems as time went on in communicating effectively, both in a written and oral fashion. Number two, the collaboration, right? Young people today may be collaborating on games and getting online, but the true nature of collaboration maybe is not being fostered the way it should there. And certainly, the critical thinking comes up time and time again that we're having a hard time fostering critical thinking skills in our young people and our students. Educators at the college level know this as a fact because anybody who's taught for a significant amount of time at the collegiate level knows over the last couple decades what we're receiving as far as students who are purported to be able to do college level work. The numbers of those students in percentage is going down, and all studies are showing this. This is happening juxtaposed against the time when these skills are in most demand by employers. So think about that problem there, right? We're not teaching young people the exact skills that
Yeah.
they need, which employers are saying that they need most highly and most acutely in new employees. So there's a disconnect there, and that disconnect has all kinds of ramifications, right? Employment ramifications, engagement in college, and being able to perform well in college, and being retained as a student. If they're not teaching these 21st century skills, they're more likely to be not engaged at community and technical colleges and more likely not to graduate and to fall out. So, it's a big issue. The four C's of 21st century skills are a big issue today. The good news is that institutions who are deploying more PBL exercises are having greater success, just as the medical schools did who deployed it in the 1960s and 70s, in seeing more highly developed critical thinking skills, communication, collaborative skills in particular. So it's something that we need to keep talking about, and we need to continue to work on if our students are going to acquire these skills and be ready for employment.
And so, out of all the four C's, are any more important to employers than the other?
Yeah, you probably, from educators, you probably get a somewhat varied response to that question. But In my mind, yes. And I'll speak both as an employer of 25 years in one capacity or another as an entrepreneur and a controls contracting or consulting firm owner for almost all of that. And also as an educator who was preparing students for careers both in building automation, HVAC, refrigeration, and even renewables, the renewable energy sector. The most commonly requested skill sets of employers would be, hey, can your students communicate effectively in a written and oral fashion, which they could usually assess themselves in an interview. But they'd always ask me that question. And hey, can they think?
Mm-hmm.
Are they critical thinkers? Are they problem solvers? And I know as an employer, I never wanted to hire people who could not think. And it sounds like it's such a easy thing to assess. It's not necessarily an easy thing to assess. But it's definitely a skill that employers look for and appreciate, because if you're an employer and you have somebody who can think, they can solve problems. And when they solve the problems, they can communicate those problems to the customer and act as almost a representative, almost like a salesperson to the customer, because they're communicating effectively the steps they took in critical thought and analysis to solve a problem.
Right.
Those are extremely important skills to have. And I know that's who I would like to hire, and that's who
Right.
Most employers like to hire. Now, they also love to have people who are creative, and I love to have people who can collaborate. But the truth of the matter is, you could be less effective on those two, right, and still be a wonderful employee.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're shallow on the communication skills, and
Right.
you're shallow on the critical thinking skills, you're consistently at a disadvantage, to others who might have those skills. So I think
Right.
those two C's are, in my mind, the most important C's.
And if I could restructure this, I would actually say that it needs to be two C's. Communication and critical thinking. And then I would actually place collaboration and creativity as subsets underneath both of those, because I think that, within those two larger C's, you should already have the ability to collaborate, because you're going to have to work in the space with your
Mm-hmm.
other coworkers. You're going to
Mm-hmm.
have to, like you said, communicate effectively to other people. But if you
Mm-hmm.
can't work with people and also do it in your way, in a creative way, add your value to whatever that project is to complete it. If you can't do all of that,
Right.
I don't even
Right.
see how the critical thinking or communication will be as effective. So I
Yeah.
think, to your point, I definitely agree. Those two are the two most important. I would love to just place those other two as subsets.
I think you're onto something there, Candace. I think you're onto something. I think communication is a broader, kind of envelope or
Mm-hmm.
umbrella for collaboration, for sure.
Yes.
Creativity, in my mind, might be a little bit different animal, but it's still, I could see it being reordered in a different structure. Um, I'll say this. I know, in my experience, I had a mother who had a master's in English, and she was a teacher. She also was an entrepreneur, and she modeled that entrepreneurial spirit and my father into me, which I really appreciate. But the other thing that she always used to tell me, which I didn't believe until I became an adult, is English is probably one of the most important classes you can take. And I was like, oh, Mom, come on, I hate English. I'm a technical guy, a science guy, engineering guy. And she always would tell me, it's great, that's all great, but you will always be limited in your effectiveness if you can't communicate what you know, or can't communicate what you can do, or can't communicate what it is that you created or
Yes.
solved or whatever. And she couldn't have been more right. She still tells me this, by the way, but she couldn't be more right. The other thing I'll say, just because I know your history with dance and I know about your background, the creativity side of it, I know there may be less people out there who have that creative side, but that's a true blessing to have that side. And that takes also fostering from your parents
For
or an
sure.
instructor to really blossom in creativity and really, um, I guess, fully realize your creative potential. Everybody has creative potential as a human,
Exactly.
but if it's not fostered and it's not developed, you never realize it and how
Exactly.
that can just, uh, expand the value of any other skills that you have in any area of discipline.
Right. And to that point, I always tell people that, creativity spans in all industries. It is essentially confidence. It's you knowing what you just said, is you knowing your value, knowing what you bring to the table. Because as you mentioned, I'll bring dancing, someone else may bring something completely different, and we put it
Mhm.
together in our collaborative
Right.
spirits, and it is awesome.
Okay.
So, knowing that value, and I think something you mentioned before with what the benefit is in growing up in a project-based learning environment, that's where you start to have that flexibility and that atmosphere and environment to learn your creativity, your value that you would then bring to the learning classroom instruction space, and then you'll be able to translate that in the working environment. And
Hmm.
so I thought that was a good point that you mentioned as well. And I think another thing, our listeners want to know is how specifically students, how can they sharpen their 4C skills inside the classroom and outside of the classroom?
Okay, I'm going to contextualize my response in your last comment there, tying creativity to being an expert in an area. So let's go back to the domains. Let's try to stitch all this together and give an
Hmm.
example here. In the psychomotor domain, the hands-on learning domain, um, the highest level of learning in that domain, which you try to get your students to the highest level in all the domains, right? But in
Right.
psychomotor, it really hit me when you brought the creative element in there because as you progress through your acumen and the levels in the hands-on skills, there's a stage where you become an expert at what you do. There's a definition of that. An expert is somebody who can take the skills, the hands-on skills, and then develop a creative product. Think about
Hmm.
that. So now,
Right.
once you've attained the highest level of skill in any discipline, let's say a basketball player, for instance. Let's take a professional basketball player, right? That's a psychomotor domain of learning.
Right.
The absolute best at what they do, the individuals who are best at what they do, are doing it creatively.
Yeah.
They're bringing the creative element to a new move or to a new way of playing the game.
Yeah.
Same thing in industry. When you become an expert and you become confident in your skills, you then are free to create in your domain, in your medium of choice. With you, you're able to creatively develop new dances or new routines.
Hmm.
With me, I can creatively deploy new methods of maybe of teaching or automation or developing laboratory environments that have not previously been developed in that way to promote learning. So the creative side is an important case study for the question that you answered. But in a
Yeah.
broader, let's get specific now to what you asked me about in more general in nature. You asked me how can students develop their
Develop
foresees
these.
in
Hmm.
wherever they're at. And it really is being exposed to project-based learning and seeking out opportunities for project-based learning where they can, um, pursue their own or have a hand in pursuing their own educational outcomes, where they can build unique projects and unique work products that they can then share with the community and work on those
That's good.
communication skills. And as they're creating those projects, they're working on creativity. And as they're working in a team environment, they have to, in essence, communicate and collaborate effectively, right?
Right.
As well. And also, they have to deploy those critical thinking skills because nobody's going to give them the answer in PBL. The answer um, has to be attained through sustained individual inquiry and research on the student's part. That involves critical thinking. So all four of those C's are highly promoted and developed under a PBL type of experience. And for students who want to gain those, they should be seeking courses, programs of study, which are steeped in PBL, or steeped in applied learning paired with the cognitive that also deploys PBL as a pedagogical approach.
That's good. That's good. You mentioned earlier that your mother imposed upon you the importance of English, that being a very important skill that, um, communication being one of the four C's. So, Brian, I'm assuming that you took her advice and you took your English courses very serious. I'm wondering if you can share with the listeners what are some ways that you have in the past or that you currently still continue to improve your own four C's skills.
Yeah, so when you teach something, okay, there's knowing something to a certain level, and then there's the level of teaching it to others. And when you teach
Yes,
something to others, it's a difference, right? It's a
very
difference.
different.
It forces you to recast what you thought you already knew and be able to describe it, explain it, and present it in a format that others can absorb. And to me, my 4C skills have improved because I've had to teach others, and I've had to be reflective about the state of my own skills. And that by itself has improved my skills. I think it might have been Einstein who said this, but you don't really truly know something until you can teach it to others. I'm sure
Yes.
you've heard that quotation before. Yeah. So
Hmm.
that's an important part of it. And then seeking out opportunities to collaborate and present to other professionals in my field, that has provided to me all the practice I'll ever need. And you can always improve, but all the opportunities for practice, let me say that, which I'll ever need in training a national cadre of instructors, or holding specific webinars on specific topics, or presenting at national conferences on specific technical topics, or
Yes.
general topics in education, or automation, you name it. That continuously provides me the opportunity to work within a community and develop those skills of
Yeah.
21st century skills, which are so important.
And taking the time to talk with me today about the four C's. That I'm sure is helping you as well develop your four C skills even further. I know it helps me every time I'm on this podcast. It's helping me definitely develop communication, as we were kind of honing in on that one a little bit earlier. Brian, thank you so much for taking the time out, teaching us about the four C's: communication, collaboration, critical thinking, and creativity. We will take a break just now. We're going to come back and wrap up this section. Thanks so much, Brian. All right, Brian, welcome back. Welcome back. Um, I, I always try to remember how long did you teach? How long were you an instructor at Georgia Piedmont Technical College? I can't remember.
Yeah, sometimes I can't remember either. I started teaching when I was a young man in my 20s, and I had a company at the time. But in the evenings, I thought it was important because of the value of technical education, and traditional education to me was great. So I basically volunteered. I got paid some small pittance, but it was nothing like I was making in my job.
Hmm.
But I taught in the evenings in the air conditioning and HVAC program. I had a little commercial HVAC too in the program at the time. Starting in, gosh, that must have been 1995 or 1996, probably before you were born. I'm guessing, or right
Yes.
around. Yeah.
Oh wait, 95. No, no, I was there. I made it. I'm born in 92.
92. Okay, so you were a little one at the time. So I was
Yeah.
teaching then, and then as I developed my business, I continued to teach, and became, um, I guess, I started teaching the first controls class in
Hmm.
2000. I donated a lot of controls to the college, and yeah, I think I even have a picture back here of that. Here you go. Um, I'll show you an interesting picture of me when I had hair.
Oh, this is
That,
good.
oh no, I don't know.
Oh, bring it a little closer. Oh, there he is.
There
Oh, Brian. No
it is.
way.
Yeah, that story was written back in, I think that was in 2000, after I had made a significant donation to the college um, of controls equipment. And to our knowledge, that was the first formal controls class ever in the United States on automation in the college. That's 20 years ago, right? So as I was continuing to run my business, I would maintain that connection and teach when I could. And then I had an interest in hiring those students too. I must have hired more than a dozen students from that program
Wow.
before it became a degree program. And then starting in 2007, after I had sold my business, I started teaching full time. And that's when we formally developed the building automation program, which was first in the state and first in the country. The commercial refrigeration program, which was first in the state, became state standard as well. And then the Green Technologies Academy, which brought in a number of renewable courses that led to a certificate, a 5-course
Right.
certificate. But the other two were and actually are state standards for Georgia and formed the basis. I know the automation program formed the basis for the Best Center being awarded a national high-level funding center to disseminate that program to a national audience. And now we have more than 100 institutions doing that. So long, windy answer to your question, but I've been teaching either part-time or full-time since 1990, we'll just say 1996 to be conservative. I think it was 95, since 1996.
1996. So that's over about 15, over that, about 15 years plus you've been instructing.
I think you're missing a decade there. I think that's 25 years.
25. Oh, I definitely missed a whole decade.
Quarter century is either a
I'm
instructor
really
or
showing I'm really showing your age and I'm really showing my age.
it's been a long time. I've come across a lot of students, and now most of who I teach are other instructors around the country. I still do guest
Right.
lecture at GPTC. I've guest lectured at Georgia State University, informally. So
Right. Teaching doesn't stop.
Mm-mm.
It's never going to stop. And I'm glad you gave us that background, because the question that I want to know is, in that environment of you being an instructor, you can talk towards GBTC specific or any other environment, but as an instructor, can you give examples of how you saw project-based learning motivating your students and providing them with with necessary skills?
Yeah, so let's just use building automation. That's a prime example. Building automation is a centerpiece of the Internet of Things. You've heard that term IoT, the Internet of Things. It really is just connecting the real world to the digital space.
Mm-hmm.
That's what building automation does. It takes sensors and devices in buildings from renewable resources, from your power meter or your power company, from security systems, from HVAC control systems, energy management systems, you name it. And it collects all that information to one central, digital virtual space under some kind of software management platform. Okay, so it lends itself very well, being the central nervous system of buildings and colleges and whatever, towards project-based learning, because it provides a window of information for students to assess and analyze and propose energy conservation measures or energy efficient measures, which could be then deployed on the campus environment itself. So in 2008, the state was going through a budget crunch because of the recession, et cetera, et cetera. And I was a full-time instructor at that time. And unfortunately, there was a cycle of reduction in force at the institution, because where instructors had to be let go because the funding from the state just wasn't there. Well, I noticed at the time some real significant inefficiencies at the college. Every institution has these inefficiencies. Any energy auditor or automation professional will tell you that no building out there I don't care where it is being run to optimal conditions. And very much less so buildings where there's not a focus on energy management necessarily. So as one of the lessons for my students, I said, well, let's just go through an energy audit, okay? A level 2 energy audit where we assess over a 3-month time span on a daily basis energy consumption, performance, start stops of the chillers, which were easy to do because they're very loud, monitor what boilers were on. And the results of that, what we found were shocking about the amount of money that was being wasted because of poor performance of the building. So we built that into a report and called for a meeting with the facilities director and the president of the institution. And that was a heated meeting, because it's almost like no matter how you present that information, it's not what they want to hear, right? That our buildings we're wasting hundreds of thousands of dollars, and they were, in energy each year because our buildings are not being run effectively and efficiently. That was the start of project-based learning at the institution because the president was so enthralled with the nature of that report being developed by students that she gave us the entire building as a playground. She said, work with the facilities director to use that building as a living laboratory. We coined that phrase back in 2008, where students can use the classroom and the broader building itself for project-based learning experiences, which will benefit the institution and benefit the buildings and the efficiency in which the students reside and learn. So we started doing that. It reminds me of also Booker T. Washington. I read in college some of his works and others, and W.E.B. Du Bois and others who were so focused on education. And one thing that always stuck with me about Booker T. Washington was the fact that he and his students built Tuskegee University brick by brick. They even built the bricks in which the buildings were built. That's the ultimate example of project-based learning. And that's what I wanted my students to experience, that same level. Because when students know that the work that they're doing on projects, they can see it, they can feel it, and it benefits themselves and leaves a legacy to others, boy, you've hit every element of that you possibly can hit in PBL. Right. So that's what we used every semester. We used PBL in every course, every semester. Every student of the program was immersed in PBL, and it works.
That's amazing, Brian. Thank you for giving me more details about that story. As you know, I interviewed Mr. Kroom, who is the current building automation and systems instructor at Georgia Piedmont Technical College, and he touched on that topic a little bit, but I got your perspective as well, and it kind of ties the whole story together. That's a real nice story that you guys have to pull out. Say it again.
I'm sorry. That's where it started. That's how it started, and it started with students. And so we kind of stumbled upon it. I was not a trained I hadn't studied education at that point in any master's or doctoral program at that point. So I just wanted to do what works, do what works. Dewey even said that. I didn't know it at the time, but do what makes sense and do what works, and follow whatever's working with your students. So I stumbled upon this because it was just working. Right. I had known about the Tuskegee history, and I had that knowledge, but as far as any formal training on how to deliver PBL, no. And then when I started to learn that later on and the effectiveness of it, and then I became a national expert in that space in living laboratories and wrote some papers and some studies and published those with the support of the Kresge Foundation and the American Association of Community Colleges and the United States Green Building Council all had a hand in making some of those papers come to fruition. I was just like, wow, this all started with students doing what works, doing what Dewey said, the educational theorist, probably the greatest one of the 20th century. He said, do what works, right? This works. And we saw it work firsthand. So it's something I'm very passionate about, and because I know it has value for students.
For sure. And what would you say are some of the challenges that teachers will face in executing PBL in their current learning structures?
Well, this is something I think we've touched on a little bit of this, but number one is the planning. There's pushback by instructors because they think it's going to add more work. They're already overworked. I know this. I was a teacher, underpaid, underworked. It's all true.
Yeah.
Um, it's unfortunate, but it's all true. And so it just sounds like more work to a teacher. But if you can get them over that initial hesitation and just help them take baby steps, and maybe give them templates along the way, it takes away some of that hesitation to engage in PBL. Over the long term, PBL is easier to manage as an instructor. Over the long term, it's less pressure on the instructor, honestly,
Mm-hmm.
because these projects are, they're not ever autopilot by any stretch,
Right.
but it's definitely a far cry from an instructor standing up for an hour and a half at a whiteboard and writing things down. It's more sitting down and working with individual groups and helping them get through their projects. So I try to tell instructors, that's going to be one of the biggest things that they face. But I try to tell them, once you get in motion and you have some of these PBL exercises developed, your job becomes pretty, I'm not say easy, but
Right.
easier. Let's say easier than trying to lecture for an hour and a half every class.
So, Brian, we talked about how PBL isn't being used enough and utilized enough in the classroom setting in general. I want to go a little bit deeper. And from your perspective, can you tell us of how PBL is being used at the technical and community college level? And is there a need for more of this educational style at that level?
Yeah, I'd say there are a lot of problem-based learning exercises in in my experience in industrial departments, in even IT departments use quite a few problems now um, in their curriculum, and that's good. I'd say less so for the projects. Um, I'd like to see more project-based learning being deployed, and for the reasons that we've stated extensively in this podcast. Um, and again, a lot of it's just the training and teaching teachers kind of a new way to think about how they deliver education, and to think a little bit about spending more time in developing those lesson plans that go along with project-based learning in particular.
Hmm.
Um, I think there's a misconception from a lot of instructors that they're doing project-based learning when they're really not doing project-based learning, when they're really doing problem-based learning. There's a lot of, um, and I'll say this, even having had this experience myself before I was trained as an educator. I probably could not have told you the difference between. I know I couldn't have told you the difference between problem-based and project-based. So there you go. Um, there's a clear difference, and there are clear differences in outcomes. But I think we need to do a better job of putting the tools in the instructor's hands to both understand the differences and then to really construct those project-based learning exercises. We're doing that work with ACP and the Best Center. Every workshop, we cast every exercise in a lesson plan, and then we share what we've taught them and what we've taken them through, the instructors, with the exact planning documents that we developed to create the exercises in which they participated. And then they take those back with them. So we're trying to make it easier. We're trying to get a storehouse of lessons, and we have quite a few already in building automation in the problem and project-based arena. So yeah, I think it's just the hesitation of instructors. I think that's why we don't see more of it, and the education of instructors to be able to do it effectively.
For sure. Definitely that hesitation, like you said, could also, I could see it stems from, or part of it stems from just not knowing, just not understanding, just not having the confidence to make that shift and take that first step. But Brian, I think that with listeners hearing all of the tips that you've provided with us and how problem and project, but focusing more on the project-based learning increases the skill sets and motivates these students. I'm hoping that with all the information you gave surrounding that topic, that is going to help increase the confidence and for these instructors to be able to take that first step. So, Brian, any last words? I've had you here for a while with lots of my questions, and I appreciate you, but any last words before we kind of conclude this segment?
Hey, I could keep talking about this all day. This is, for me, this is like dance for you. This is what really excites me. So, hey, you want to talk more? I can talk more, but I'll just say thank you for doing what you're doing with the podcasting. And I think getting more of these and more of this information out is going to help instructors, educators, even students around the United States. So I applaud the work, and thanks again for having me. I'd love to talk about this anytime.
Oh, Brian, don't worry. I'm gonna call on you for the next one because I'm gonna need you. So get ready. I know you will be.
Thanks.
Thanks, Brian. We'll talk soon. Have a good day. All right, bye.